In this presentation, I will talk about the g.v.black's principles of tooth preparation. When dentistry marry engineering, the result would be a correct tooth preparation. Guys, you should always have a mind of an engineer and a mind of a doctor to have a good tooth preparation. What I am going to mention from the principles that g.v.black has put are more applicable for the amalgam restoration rather than for the composite restoration, because when g.v.black has put these principles, the composite restorations were not in use. Okay, they are general principles to be considered, but they are more applicable for amalgam rather than for composite, as we said. These principles are 5 principles: the outline form, the resistance form, the retention form, the convenience form, and the final cleaning and polishing and finishing of the preparation. I would like to give a note here that other authors have put 6 principles, adding the final smoothing and preparation of the walls and the removal of the unsupported enamel from the tooth. But I think this is can be divided between the resistance form and the final cleaning of the preparation, so that there is no need to add that sixth principle. The first principle is the outline form. The outline form is that you should always try to plan where you would put your preparation, including all the folds, all the caries, and all the previous restoration, if it was a retreatment procedure of the previous restoration. And also you should complete your preparation on a sound tooth structure. The second principle is the resistance form. When I say a resistance form, I indicate for 2 things: the resistance form for the tooth structure and the resistance form for the restoration. If I am a tooth and I want to be resistant to the occlusal forces, I should have only one thing put in my mind, which is to be thick enough to withstand these occlusal forces, so that in general, to have a resistance form for a tooth, it should have enough thickness. And when I say enough thickness, according to my clinical experience, it should be no less than 2 millimeters thickness. Guys, believe me, the authors say it should be included to 0.2 millimeter, 0.25 millimeter, 0.26 millimeters. These, a quarter of a millimeter or less or a little more, are very tiny measurements. But we don't have this app in our eyes, because we are not iPhones, so that we can measure this tiny, very tiny measurement. The millimeter itself is very tiny for us, and we may don't know if it is a 1.5 or less than a millimeter. So that I don't think that a quarter of a millimeter or a half of a millimeter are some things that are really applicable, but when they are mentioned in the textbooks like Sturtevant's or Cohen pathways of the pulp, all or any other textbook, very well known textbook in conservative dentistry, or even the contemporary fixed prosthodontics for the crown and the bridge, all of these books, when they mention these precise measurements, they do not mean to do this exactly, but near it. So that again, for the tooth structure, we should always have no less than 2 millimeters almost as a thickness for a tooth, so that it will be resistant to the occlusal forces and it will not fracture. We should prepare no more than 1/3 of the width of the tooth. If you look, guys, at this picture, you would notice that almost 1/3 of the tooth is only prepared, because if we took more than 1/3 of the tooth structure, the tooth will be weakened. No less than 0.5 millimeter between preps. Again, it is not really an 0.5, but almost 0.5 millimeter between preps. I mean this, for example, if we go back to the first picture, look at these two preparations on the occlusal surface of the premolar. We will see that there is almost, let's say, 4 or 5 millimeters between the two cavities, so that we kept them separated. But if the caries is extended and from the mesial side and from the distal side, and there is only 1 millimeter or a half millimeter between them, it is better to communicate them and make them as one cavity. This is what I meant in the third sentence, which is no less than 0.5 millimeter between preps. And of course, for a tooth structure to be resistant, there should be no unsupported enamel rods, because they will fracture. On the other hand, the resistance form for the restoration, again, if I am a restoration and I want to be resistant to fractures and occlusal forces, I should have a minimal thickness of 2 millimeters if I am amalgam, but that differs from restoration to restoration, the components in the restoration, the type of the restoration. Composite restorations differs from amalgam restorations, etc. But in general, as an amalgam restoration, it should have at least 2 millimeters thickness so that it will not fracture. The composite restoration is almost always the same. And also, the second most important thing to have a resistance form for a restoration is not just its thickness, but its back. Its back must not be supported by a stress concentration area. A stress concentration area is the area that in it the stress concentrates on a back of a restoration, leading to a fracture of the restoration, so that we should always avoid this. The last thing for a restoration to be resistant is to have a cavo surface angle of a tooth with a 90 degree. 90 degree is the typical cavo surface angle for a tooth preparation, so that we will have a resistance form for it, and the restoration